hope you can hear me. So sometimes social dialogue is seen as something a little bit abstract in the sense that there are discussions between social partners and with the governments and so on very important issues. But sometimes social dialogue, in addition to that, leads to very concrete results. And I think this morning we have the opportunity to discuss a case in point with 14 agreements between social partners reached over the past 2 years, 14 agreements on issues as important as platform workers, policies to tackle the impact of the pandemic on employment, and last and not least, labor market reform, which, as we all know, is something extremely controversial in all countries, including also in Spain. And so it's very difficult, and these agreements, by the way, were not only agreements between the social partners, but they were later on embedded into the legislation which has been approved and enacted at the moment by the country, by the government, by the parliament, and therefore by the country. So it's not possible to go in detail into the content of those agreements, not even in any of those in particular, but I think maybe the most interesting question is what is the process of social dialogue which enables these agreements to happen, and not only to happen, but also to be later on included in national legislation, therefore become a reality in the country. I think this may be the most interesting question. And the second question we may want to address in this panel is what are the new challenges which emerge for social dialogue? I will shift to Spanish now because it's, tenemos la oportunidad.
We have the opportunity to have a really great panel. These are the key players in these 14 social agreements that have been signed over the last few years, and the labour reform, which was approved at the end of 2021, which includes, of course, the Ministry of Labour, represented here by the Secretary of State, and that's Joaquin Perez-Rey, the Deputy Minister. And then we have Mari Cruz Vicente, who's the Secretary of Trade Union Action Employment, Rosa Santos, who's the Director of Employment, Diversity and Social Protection for the Employers Organization, the CEOE. And we have Teresa Diaz de Terán, Director of Employment, Diversity and Social Protection for the Small and Medium Enterprise Organization, and also Fernando Luján, who's from UGT, one of the main trade unions. So before we move on to their perspectives and the key ingredients for social dialogue to work effectively, and specific agreements and legislation being applied at the moment with the results that we've seen this morning, and as a growth of employment, which has surprised me positively, and I'm sure the Secretary of State will want to comment on this. And so we have results there. And we will hear how these agreements have been possible and the new challenges involved. We have the opportunity to listen to Oscar Molina from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, who will set the context for social dialogue in Spain. Please go ahead, Oscar. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think this is an opportunity to really emphasize the value of social dialogue in the Spanish case beyond the labor reform, which is the focus of attention. But I think we should underline that there's a whole process of going back many years. Some of us talked about social dialogue was something hidden away very often, but there has been a huge effort by the social partners. We need to recognize their work there to really get through difficult moments and to keep going. So I think the labour reform and some of the specific reforms achieved in the last 2 or 3 years need to be seen from that point of view. This is really a building process, building gradually, where we see the results that we're now analysing. So my intention with this brief introduction is to set the scene for social dialogue in Spain and the European context also, and the historical context. This is the true value of social dialogue. So I think we all have present in our minds that there have been some key moments in our history here in Spain since the transition and this process of adjustment to the economic and monetary changes. There's been a huge effort to develop mechanisms of coordination to be able to achieve those goals, facing inflation and then considering the Treaty of Maastricht and the major recession we had, the COVID recession then, and also the crisis of the cost of living crisis. And the growth in inflation. So this goes back a long way. And very often, a lot of progress has been made as a result of these crises, and this is something we should really emphasize. So in the European context, which is what I've been working on over the last few years, I would say that our Spanish experience is perhaps a bit unique in many aspects. So when we analyze and look at a specific case of difficulty and how we've got through this, through our labor relations, I think this is a country where social dialogue has really been most prolific and positive. So we've seen situations where we've been really bipartite and tripartite between employees, employers, and government. So really, I think our case as South European country is one of the most interesting. So looking at the labour reform and possible contribution to social dialogue, I wanted to make a couple of points there as regards social dialogue in the Spanish case specifically. So we've talked over these days about this, and I think this is really an instrument of governance, social dialogue, and this is particularly important in the context of Europe, where we have tools for macroeconomic adjustment. Social dialogue, particularly in the Spanish case, has become a key instrument for adjustment, for change. So this is really a need to look for solutions through our social partners. Governments has been there to really use this lever, as it were. It's talking about this lever to help economy across the board. So we all have clear in our minds the adjustments and changes in monetary reform and these tripartite agreements with collective bargaining and on employment. So I think really this has been very successful with regard to the economy. So we should underline a second aspect, and there social dialogue has a multi-level focus. Europe is always there. We can often think it's positive or negative because there are a lot of conditioning factors in social dialogue. But I think Europe has played a key role promoting social dialogue. So it's important, particularly here, to think of the Copernican change and the vision of social dialogue and the impulse that we've seen in the member countries to reinforce democracy and improve working conditions. So going into the specific contribution to social dialogue through the labour reforms, I would see these as perhaps a discovery of the Holy Grail, perhaps. We've been working for a long time to discover something through lots of reforms, and we've often been thinking that where's this Holy Grail of security and safety? And I think we've finally found it. We've found a reform, an instrument which really embodies the essence of what this is all about, flexibility, security. And this has been very much criticized. I think we have really found the essence of safety and security at work. This is thinking about the famous Dutch and cases, the French cases. There have been mechanisms of adaptability introduced, guaranteeing the protection of workers. So, Danish case, sorry, was the other one. So, I think in this case, social dialogue has really lined up with the needs of the economy. Social dialogue has to play a key role there in assisting the economy, and sometimes it's not done that. We know this. But in this case, I think they've managed to line up effectively. We have this idea of a model of growth where internal demand plays a key role, and labour reform, what it's done is to correct a problem, a structural problem of short-term labour, casual labour, which really created a lot of insecurity in the economy because short-term employment and casual work has really affected internal consumption. So we've seen over these months the confirmation of these imbalances and how they affect our economy and our labour market and how they've been softening and smoothing out over this period. So we've had a strong alignment through this social reform and aligning what has been decided with what is internal demand, domestic demand, and paying particular attention to the most disfavoured among the population as an engine for the economy. So this is confirmed by our data. So I would say that if we think of previous reforms which had attempted to force internal devaluation and make us much more of an exporting country, but this is very difficult if you don't have lots of other social adjustments, reforms. I think this reform, in contrast, has helped us to smooth over our economic cycle and line up with the needs of economic cycles. So what does social dialogue do now in this current context of inflation? I think here we've talked a lot about the possibility of an income agreement. We've looked at the experiences of adjustment in amongst other countries around us, thinking of going back to the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, those countries that we referred to as neo-corporate, they went through a huge adjustment thanks to salary moderation policies. But I think in the case of Spain, social dialogue must contribute to a twofold objective, which is difficult but possible. First of all, it has to guarantee that those who are in the labour market in the worst possible situation, workers who receive a minimum salary, so that they can improve their purchasing power and not decrease it. So inflation is really regressive in the labour market. So this is a first objective, to guarantee the improvement in purchasing power for those least favoured groups. Also, we must be able to guarantee capacity of recovery in the economy to improve our ability to compete and guarantee that there may be a path towards recovery and that this path does not interfere with the capacity of our companies to compete. So we need to achieve both of those objectives, and this is tough. I think the agreement reached in the public sector for their employees, for civil servants, this marks then, I think, an approach. It's good balance between those two objectives we mentioned, and I hope I believe that we'll be debating these subjects, and social dialogue in the case of Spain, I hope that we'll work towards achieving these objectives. So I don't want to take up any more time, and I think that this debate will mark down our key approaches for the social partners. here in Spain. Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you for your introduction. I think we could sum this up as the main asset of social dialogue is to achieve balance, lining up the needs of the economy, but also bearing in mind the social rights and maintaining these rights so that these are not in a state of tension, because very often there are contradictions, but social dialogue will enable us to achieve those and combine those two objectives, thinking about inflation also, how can we reduce these costs to be able to, as part of social dialogue. And I think this has been achieved in other circumstances in the past. So I think we can open the floor now to our panel and start with the Secretary of State. It's been 2.5 years since the pandemic began, and we never expected some of this. So what, from your point of view, Joaquin, has been the main asset in social dialogue? So, and in the economic history of the country, we've had in the past recessions where we've an increase in unemployment up to over 20%, but not in this case. So how is this being achieved, Deputy Minister for Employment? Thank you very much to everyone who's been following us. It's a great pleasure to be here involved in the global deal, which is really the loudspeaker for social dialogue. And this enables us to share our modest experience in Spain with other countries. So this can be, I think there's some premises for social dialogue to work effectively, some important premises. I think the condition of being able to have a dialogue over the agenda of a government. Governments have a program and initiatives for legislation and instruments to be able to carry this out. But if governments separate themselves from social dialogue in a very unilateral way, then social dialogue, well, of course, would not function. So the Ministry of Labour, of Employment and Social Economy was clear about the structural reforms that were needed to achieve progress. So Professor Molina mentioned that we've always been linked to a strong past of precariousness in the labour market. We've had that record of precariousness. So really, we've had to have dozens of reforms, over 50, that have been, in fact, ineffective in the past. So the first element was to be clear that we really needed to use our social partners, all our spokesmen and women, to get over these imbalances. And as Raymond said, we needed a dialogue-based reform which achieves this mix of efficiency and the guarantee of social rights. And as well as this balance, effectiveness, efficiency, which is the other fundamental element. So something reached through dialogue is really allows us to keep our feet on the ground and use the experience of our social partners, of our spokespersons, and really look at the daily life of companies and their needs, the needs of the employers and employees. So I don't have a great deal of merit here because I have many experts like Teresa Fernando Santos and other experts who've really proved their conviction in this area. So the social dialogue as a method of governance of labour relations enables us to have effective reforms, efficient reforms, and really balanced ones, and will respond to real problems not divorced from the daily reality of companies. And this requires an element of what we're in a international social forum. So we need to have the right sort of social partners who will be sufficiently represented. So I think social dialogue as a mechanism which broadens democracy and brings in a lot more legitimacy for regulations is only achieved in an environment of total respect for the rights of the collective bargaining, workers' rights, the fundamental rights of laid down by and mentioned very often by the ILO. So we need to have this strong conviction to bring in these reforms, recognizing the need for these reforms. So in Spanish experience, I think this is seen very clearly. We've come from a desert in terms of social dialogue in the past, which has meant that we've had social partners taking major decisions. It would have been non-existent in the past, social partners taking important decisions in labour reforms. And the results of this lack of dialogue were unfair results, which did not guarantee a balance between all those needs we mentioned. So we need to recover social dialogue right from the start. And when we were looking at the background of this social dialogue, we were all surprised, those of us who have participated in this event, and which has changed everybody's life, the experience of the pandemic and the concern and the worry that this arose, and we made us realize that we had to respond to a situation we've never seen before. And this pandemic had devastating effects on labour markets. So there are many figures that bear this out. So this was perhaps the worst possible scenario, to have to announce that 800,000 jobs had diluted from night to day through the pandemic. So this brought us the realization of a strong commitment to save our fellow citizens with ambitious measures which would be different from those taken in the past. And we had to protect our companies and our workers and protect the country from this huge disaster, this disappearance of so many jobs. So we had hours locked up together with a clear decision that only valid was a true agreement. That was the only thing we could have, with a clear diagnosis of our situations. So I think this was one key element. So looking at the problems of the labour market, I think we all had reached a similar diagnosis, that our solutions might have been different in our way of tackling these, and it was very difficult to achieve common decisions. But all of us who were on that panel around the table realized that our labour market was not working effectively, and we had to make these major changes. So these changes really brought together this labour reform, which has been the great success of social dialogue. And as Raymond said, if anyone had thought a couple of years ago that we were going to achieve a labour reform that was as far-reaching as we've achieved, we would have thought that it was absolutely something that somebody who was completely mad would have said this was possible. So sharing this diagnosis, I think there was a clear desire to resolve some of the key problems we've seen in our society. We've seen the figures for October on casual work and unemployment. These could be summed up quite quickly. Spain had produced a labour market that was very volatile. Every time there was certain economic turbulence, the impact in terms of jobs was always negative. So we lost many jobs in this context of economic uncertainty, and this made us always work with poor rules, with bad systems of dismissal and a lot of maladjustment to labour market. So we saw that there was another way to do things, and that internal flexibility could produce good results to get over the crisis without destroying jobs. So this element, which was introduced into the labour reform with greater changes. This is how, through social dialogue, we've managed to affirm, and I hope that my fellow panelists will agree with this, that we've been able to see a cultural change in labour relations across the board. So with inflation and increasing prices and supply chain difficulties and energy prices, the difficulty over salary debates and wages, if in the month of October, which is traditionally a bad month for employment, today we can say we have almost 30,000 unemployed less in Spain. We would have found it difficult to believe this if we'd been told this before, but we've achieved this to bring down employment in a traditionally bad month with in a context of economic uncertainty. So we've just heard the data, the figures today. 1 of every 2 contracts signed in October were permanent contracts. So we've signed 700,000 permanent contracts, which is multiplying by 5 what had happened in previous months. So this is an enormous change, a move towards stability, which has changed the basis of our labour relations. So what's behind this really? A commitment to democracy and a rejection, a shared rejection of continuing with this negative model, this model that we have in our heads, which often we think is the best one, has to change constantly through our conversations to be able to achieve the best results and to have achieved, in the case of Spain, very positive, spectacular results. I really have to say, I didn't expect myself to really achieve these fantastically fast results, which have been so efficient, particularly in terms of casual labour. So, not to abuse my to take over too much time, I would like to really pass on to the other speakers. So I think really in Spain we've got those really excellent representatives with the capacity to transfer over to workers and employers and companies what capacity, what decision-making capacity they have. And I think also a conviction that in the case of the social dialogue panel, that I think perhaps it sounds a bit overboard, but I think we have achieved a model, a sensation that we could really contribute major advantages to the production sector. This is a huge responsibility that our social partners had in a country in the worst possible circumstances, and they had to set an example of agreement. We had to really set this example, and this has really permitted the success of social dialogue in Madrid. And we've not rejected any debate, no matter how difficult it was. And we'll have opportunity, I think, to go into this more deeply. So this has not just brought labour reform, it's also witnessed the new scenarios in the labour market, because we have a regulation for also huge use of digital technology, which has also been regulated through a social dialogue agreement. So even in subjects that were really very complex and difficult, with a burden of having to face the future, we have managed to include this in our social dialogue and in our agreements. So this has been fantastic. Thank you.
I think your presentation has been very complete and very clear about the keys of social dialogue and how we have achieved this with so many agreements. There's an element, Maricruz, that I imagine will have been decisive, and that is how to manage at the same time that diagnosis and the awareness that we have a huge challenge with the pandemic and other crises, and the impatience of society in order to change things rapidly. So I imagine that for a person like yourself who has participated in those dialogues, that must have been complicated. So how do you view that? How to manage at the same time the social pressure to change quickly, something that created a temporary situation, but we had to have a balanced and agreed situation. I would like to thank you for the organization of this debate, and we are here gathered in social partners who've participated in this dialogue. And in the history of democratic history in our country, I think that this process has undoubtedly been the most intense, and also and particularly all the agreements that have been taken to the social dialogue table are in the official state gazette. So we've created rules through dialogue and negotiation and agreement. And I think that is a very important question, because not all the process of social dialogue have always finished in the official state gazette. And there are many agreements that have been left behind along the way without the possibility of writing them down. But this focus on social dialogue is different now. And so therefore, it is also more complex, if you like. The truth that to speak after Joaquin, who's summarized quite in depth, not superficially, well, you can say we could go home, really, but you might think that. But we all have our own experience to contribute. And we started from a need, an imperious need to reform the labor reform of 2012, not out of a whim, but because it was a reform that generated up to 6 million people unemployed, 6 million unemployed. It was a reform that generated a salary devaluation, which we'd never experienced before in our country, and temporary work, which was increased tremendously, and all the employment that was generated was temporary. That temporary nature of the work and the access to work and jobs is what we've been able to achieve with this reform. These were three elements that were very important, and in our trade union, Comisiones Obreras, we were insisted on changing that, and that was the first condition in order to start a process of social dialogue, and we initiated that with a reform, and we had to stop that when the pandemic arose at that moment. And I think the experience of the negotiation of the six agreements that we made during the pandemic has been an experience that has been of use to us also to continue making progress in the process of social dialogue. And I must say that there is an important element, and that is that the first agreement that laid the basis for the following agreements was an agreement which beforehand had been agreed in a bipartite context between business and trade union organizations. That was a very important step in order to bring together with something that we thought was necessary, and that was to seek measures for internal flexibility that were agreed and that would prevent, in a situation that we didn't really know what the impact was going to be. We thought that it was going to be great, and it was really more than what we thought at the time when we were negotiating this agreement. But the fundamental goal was that there should not be a destruction of employment, a mass destruction of employment in our country. And I think that we've achieved that, and we've achieved it an awful lot. And we can be proud, governments, business and trade unions. We've saved more than 3 million employments, jobs, thanks to the agreements during the pandemic. And apart from that, in the period of the pandemic, we were able to scale up other agreements which were being interlinked. And I think it is important to mention them And I think that the agreement on riders that Joaquin mentioned is a very small agreement, but it took us 9 months to negotiate it. And I think that sometimes we don't give enough importance to things that we do, but I think that was one of the agreements that has a fundamental importance, because in a short time, many millions of women and men workers in Spain, Europe, and in the world are going to work through the digital platforms. And we've been able to regulate distribution as well. And we have to continue to make progress so that digital platforms do not allow escaping from labor rights. And so it has to be regulated. And so still there is a lot of interesting work left to do. And let's see what happens with the European directive that is being negotiated. And I think that that will also be a foundation in order to make progress in the country as a whole. And secondly, I think that we have looked at the minimum salary, sometimes with agreement, sometimes without an agreement, but always with a process of negotiation trying to look for agreements. I think the regulation of teleworking is a model. I think it is indeed being used in Europe as a reference for the directive on teleworking also. And those agreements, together with regulatory developments for the plans for equality in companies and the salary register in order to finish the discrimination, salary discrimination, and the social agreements, together with those deals in the defense of employment, they led, in the end, when the pandemic dissipated, we went back to discuss the labor reform. A lot of time had gone past with a rule that was not adequate enough, and it was harming a lot of workers, also for the business model, and to be able to face a situation for the future in the context of the companies that way of hiring was generating with instability in employment, also for training, for qualified staff. So there's a lot of problems that were being arising, and these were common problems. There were different ways of interpreting things. There were a lot of discrepancies. And I think the work that has been done is to try with the moderator, an exceptional moderator, that was the government itself, to come to that that combination. And I think there were some ways of seeing things by all sides that we knew had to change. And indeed, I think that is what has motivated us. And I think this has been very important, because I see that in all negotiations it is important to generate a climate of trust, so that the different parties have that trust among themselves in order to know what we are going to do, and we are committed to that. I think that we've shown that, and that climate has also encouraged agreements to come forward. And without doubt, when you have an agreement like this, like labor reform, which is a deep agreement, a strong agreement, which has tackled things from the roots, there are always things that are left behind. If it hadn't been so, an agreement wouldn't have been possible. So therefore, I think that we've done it well. And without doubt, the unemployment data today, which are very good, I think cannot be explained without that social dialogue and the contribution of social dialogue, not only for the quality of employment, but also for creating employment. Nobody could have understood that this has happened without those social agreements in the defense of employment in a time which has been so grey and hard as during the pandemic. So therefore, I think that we can take with us some very positive experiences for the future about how we can do things, and the government can rest now, mustn't fully rest, because we have to maintain that social dialogue to continue forward. Well, in a second round, we can see the challenges, perhaps, of the future. Rosa, I imagine that at that moment of that the discussion of the labour reform and others, one of the difficulties from the point of view of an organisation like CEOE has been the heterogeneity, and now with the energy crisis, or everything, the impacts are also asymmetric. But the starting point was the reform in 2012. So how were you able to face those negotiations in that very varied context, where some companies felt comfortable, others not? And so how did you achieve that? Well, first of all, I would like to thank a lot the invitation to participate in this forum. For me, it's always a pleasure to be able to share a roundtable with people who have accompanied us for 3 years, day and night, and of course also with Oscar and with yourself, Raymond. So indeed, for us, it has been a very hard path, because we started with an election process in which a government was set up with a political colour very far to the left because of the coalition pact with Podemos, the Podemos party, and this was a coalition agreement. It was the first time that this existed in Spain, and we've had experiences also in many regions, in autonomous communities. Mine in Aragon, there's a long experience of coalitions, but it's not an experience which had been tried out in Spain, in the nation as a whole. And indeed, the government to implement its reforms, if it chooses social dialogue, like Secretary, or is it the Parliament really that has led the government to actually choose social dialogue as a way of governing? What is true is that I do agree that social dialogue in governing helps reforms to generate more confidence in investors, in society, and to be more stable over time. More stability is presumed over time, and you've said it all of you have said this, and it balances things. And we faced labour reform from the perspective of a government agreement in which what was being said with the starting point of the 2012 reform. And Marie Cruz was saying this, it was just before the pandemic, and we just started to make those contacts about the future labour reform. And then suddenly the pandemic came along, and we had to concern ourselves then that these more urgent matters, because of the state of alarm and the catastrophic situation that we experienced in all countries, and very particularly in Spain, for companies and for individuals and workers also equally. So I don't know, this was chosen as a method of governing, or perhaps reality is very stubborn, and Parliament has such a fragmentation that it was impossible to come to agreements. But what is true is that there was, as a result, a commitment which we were not obliged with. And it is important to stress this, I think, we, the enterprise, perhaps the unions, yes, but the enterprise were not obliged to share that agreement with that government agreement with the coalition government, but but we are committed to quality and stable employment, and we are well aware, first of all, of the extent of the goal that we were setting ourselves, our predecessors and the trade unions and previous governments had also tried, and there were many reforms which tried to face the same problems that we tried to deal with. More employment stability, more quality, and really more resilience in the labour market in order to make it more resistant to those changes which have led us generally to generating a lot of employment in times of bonanza and destroying it at the same speed that we created it. And so in the context of the debate of the labour reform with the business organizations, there were a series of questions that were key that obliged us also to encourage a cultural change within our organizations, and that is temporary employment, though necessary, when it is laid down as a generalized dynamic without a strategy, in other words, but simply as a standard sustained over time, not thinking about needs, is not good either for business or companies or employees, because you don't get the loyalty of the workers. You can't have a professional career. You can't have lifelong training. And there are so many other things that can, and it does not favor the economy either. So it is important to change that culture and to encourage a cultural change of that way of hiring, temporary hiring, which was the usual way of working, and to make it more stable. But obviously, in order not to upset the economy completely, we needed to find the instruments in order to be able to do that. And in line with that, it is essential that the quality of employment improves, not just through stability, but also to make some corrections, which we had to acknowledge. The previous laws, not only the law in 2012, but other laws, previous laws, were producing effects that we did not wish, and the trade unions did not either, and that is why we made some corrections that I will mention later. But the aim, as I said, was to make the labour market more resilient. And in our case, you were asking me, with a very hard debate, and it's still continuing. You can see it in the media. It's a tough debate, and that's normal, because when we are changing practice, but also changing a culture, and I think that is what it committed us to do in the debate on the labour reform, then there are things that happen that are difficult. There are times of not understanding, and also I have to say this, that we planned a labour reform in order to start up at a time of normality, economic, social, political normality. And the labour reform has fully got going on the 1st of April in a context of absolute lack of normality with geopolitical situations, which is making it difficult to get raw materials, with the war in Ukraine, which is making production costs more expensive, with an increase of inflation, which is affecting hugely affecting workers and companies also. And it's not improbable that we will still have to make some adjustments if we deem it necessary. So it has been planned for. It was planned for a completely different context. So what I'm trying to say here is that the reform itself has a mechanism of self-control, of self-assessment. I think that in 25. This is planned for that, but it wasn't planned for this context. But with all this internal noise and the difficulties, internal difficulties, and also external difficulties, because there's been a kind of a tutorship of what was being of the discussion tables, but we committed ourselves to stability and quality in employment, and for that we seek a figure that would help, and that's the discontinuous continuous. This is versatile, flexible way of hiring for companies with support from the state also, but with today's data, it is key element in sustaining employment with this format. In other times, it would have been mass temporary work. That is not happening. I'm very cautious, and Oscar was talking about the Holy Grail, and the Secretary of State was a little bit less exaggerated, but I think that caution is necessary, because there are adverse economic data. The predictions for 2023 are not good. The interest rates are also going to go up, but it's true also that the labor market is surviving, and so we've achieved our projection, and other corrections have been made in order to prevent the devaluation of wages and salaries. To the collective agreements should also apply to subcontractors, and so broaden the number of workers who this collective bargaining is applicable to, and internal flexibility, which will reduce during, like, the layoffs in the pandemic, and still today, according to the data, correct me if I'm wrong, Joaquin, but the layoff data is being reduced in a time, in a context where costs are going up, when raw materials are difficult to obtain, and where those tools like and so in practice, this shows that, at least for the time being, the labor market is showing itself to be more resilient in spite of the difficult economic and uncertain economic context. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you for your view, your vision. It's very clear, very direct, how you've experienced all this period of reforms and some of the challenges that we're faced with. Teresa, in your case, you represent small and medium-sized companies. These enterprises had most resorted to temporary contracts in order to manage the coming and going of markets. So this has changed. So how have you achieved that? Rosa was talking about a cultural change in hiring and managing staff in companies, sometimes as a result of the regulations or a combination of things. How have you achieved this in small and medium-sized companies? Tell us more generally about social dialogue in that context. Well, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I would also like to thank the invitation granted to us to participate in the second forum. I think it is an annual forum of the social dialogue of the global deal, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Raymond was mentioning the vision from SMEs for the adaptation of this labor reform with regards to temporary hiring. It is true that the majority of the productive fabric in Spain is SME, micro, small and medium enterprise, but this is most of the productive fabric in Spain. But we have a smaller size of companies like in Europe, but together with the Spanish Confederation for Business Organization, we have common objectives because we have the companies that we represent and the organizations have interests that overlap. And so we are the organization. I think we are one of the most important, I think, that the COE has. And in the social dialogue, we try to make those interests come together for labor reforms. Small and medium-sized enterprises are extremely interested in labor reform working, and that temporary hiring should be just what it is, because it is an activity sector that is temporary, and we are interested in fighting against insecurity, job insecurity, and excessive uses of that when there shouldn't be that insecurity, in sectors where it shouldn't be used. And so we defend temporary work in the sectors that are productive and that need that temporary work. But even so, as we're seeing, the labor reform is producing its results. And I think that still it is early in order to assess it and evaluate it, because the results of membership and employment are good. We cannot deny that. I think we've been 6 months now, more or less, since the labor reform started. And I think that for any labor reform, it's still early to make an assessment more in depth. But the data are good up to now, and we congratulate ourselves together with the secretaries of the different trade union organizations. And having said this, I wanted to also, more generally, I wanted to make an assessment not just of the labor reform which Rosa mentioned, and also Maricruz, and they mentioned this very well, but I want to focus a little bit on social dialogue. And the labor reform is part of this social dialogue. And I want to refer, and changing the focus a little bit, to want to talk about the tradition that we have in Spain with regards to social dialogue, which is part of our history. And we have to stress the role since the Spanish Constitution, since 1978. It has been a socio-economic instrument. Social dialogue is an instrument, that a tool that has allowed us to normalize democracy that we're enjoying now, which has allowed us to develop socio-economically, and it has allowed us a system of labor relations like the one that we have now. And so therefore Spain has a long tradition of social dialogue, and it is true that there has been times of more activity or times of less activity, and now during the pandemic, that was a time of great activity, and it has been a tool that was extraordinarily useful when overcoming the economic crisis that arose from the health crisis. And thanks to social dialogue, thanks to the boost given by the social partners and the government, but starting with the social partners who were able to having that tripartite agreement, which led to all the social agreements later in the defense of employment. Thanks to that work, we managed in the crisis in 2020 and 2021 we've been able to maintain employment and the survival of companies at the same time. And this is something that is extraordinary, and we were committed to that all together, government and trade unions. And this role of the social dialogue, although it has been in our history with the intensity and the achievements of this last phase of the pandemic in which we have been immersed, I think that we can say that it is a milestone that we hadn't seen before, in spite of the fact that it was very important, as I already stressed, in the makeup of our social and labor system. We still have a lot to do, but those of us here, the organizations that we represent, we are firm. We are firmly convinced about social dialogue, and our activities are constant. Our activity is constant, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less. But with this instrument, as I say, at the front line, when crises or adverse economic situations arise. The labor reform is an example of it, with all the agreements that have been mentioned. I'm not going to mention them again, because not only did we negotiate layoffs, but we also had significant agreements that Maricruz and Rosa have also mentioned. And that was at a time that was really very complex, and that has to be stressed, and we can feel proud of it. And Spain can be an example in that sense in order to face future crises or crises that might be around the corner. Thank you very much, Teresa, for sharing your perspective.
Un cuarto de hora nada más.
So we have another 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to extend the question a bit for Fernando. Bearing in mind the fact that we've achieved those 14 agreements in labour reform, perhaps the context, although this could be dramatic, the loss of production capacity, the closure of businesses as a result of the pandemic, well, I think we're perhaps in a more difficult context because of inflation right now, not just the pandemic and its effects, but pandemic, of course, as our Professor Oscar or our lecturer has mentioned, this has made a big difference. But inflation, I think, divides people tremendously. And so what about the role of social dialogue with the backdrop of inflation? I think this is a key question at the moment. What is the role of social dialogue in this new context, which can divide interests of the different parties involved? Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you for the invitation on behalf of the trade unions, and this opportunity to be able to express our concerns. And so really this is personal on the part of my organization, and it was the Spanish government that really moved forward the global deal, and Stefan who pushed forward this initiative to have a forum. So this forum should really serve us also as a way of emphasizing exactly where we are at this moment and where we have to move towards. We're in the fourth industrial revolution now, and we think that the challenges that we have, the challenges that we face are the challenges we've always faced: low salaries, excessively long working hours, unexpected changes in working hours, and also frequent changes in employment and health effects of particular jobs. I think that this is not a neutral situation. The Secretary of State mentioned this, and I share his view. It's very important that economic policies really work in the best direction possible. Spain 10 years ago witnessed an agreement in favor of collective bargaining. This was 2012. So this underlined the importance of effective collaboration between employers and workers. But 6 days later, we had imposed on us a labour reform which was absolutely opposing our interests in the trade unions, and this proved to be very ineffective. But it had to do with the political objectives of the government at that time. Now, in 2022, 10 years later, we find ourselves in a situation which is the opposite. We have achieved an agreement which is working effectively and has been the result of a rejection of ignoring the legitimate aspirations and interests of the workers, reaching our labour reform, and I don't want to go into that anymore because it's been discussed, but I think as soon as we finish this exchange of opinions in this forum, we will be going to a demonstration in the Plaza Mayor in the center of Madrid, because we have not been able to reach an agreement through collective bargaining, which did occur 10 years ago. So it appears that this impulse is important through the public administrations, but I think this forum must serve to unify our policies from the point of view of from a global point of view, because we don't have globalization for labor regulations as regards how the rights of workers are protected and respected. So they do see that this is how we see it from the UGT. So it's very important that there should be a unification of views and that these rights should be protected. So we've talked about how the crisis affects us with the increase of prices, huge increase in consumer prices. Well, this is very relevant, how we face this, thinking of public policies and governmental policies, how they should counteract the effect of these price rises. So this is our objective, to share out wealth. Wealth must be shared out fairly, and we must talk commonly about how to face the problems of increased consumer prices. So we can do this in many different ways. If we look at perhaps things that we haven't gone into deeply enough, questions that we haven't discussed enough, in Spain, we see that there is an expulsion of dismissal of workers from the labor market, convincing those workers that this is a type of subcontracting system, and that this is necessary because of digital economy and digital technology. I think we have to redefine what a working contract is and how this is protected. We have to have some fundamental reductions in the dependency that we've seen. So in the social dialogue, there have been changes that have to do with the role of social partners. But we have to see a redefinition of dependency in the labor market. This is fundamental. We have to underline that these two articles and this small reform in legislation on digital platforms that has occurred should serve as an impulse to regulate all other areas. Where are the employers and where are the working labor contracts and what is in them? This is something we have to deal with in this country. Also the regulations on self-employed work. I think in Spain we have 3 self-employed workers associations, which are the most representative ones. And this covers almost all self-employed workers. But one refers very much to employers. The other is very closely linked to Comisiones Obreras, trade union, and the third refers to us, to UGT. So, but we see our problems from different points of view. And I think we need to define what is a work contract, the right to a job in the 21st century, taking on board the technological changes and the algorithms which are regulated under the platforms law, digital platforms law. And this has to do with robotization and automation. So I think together we have to bolster work contracts as a source of job creation and bolstering the right to a job to be able to avoid that fundamental rights which are considered normal. We have to make sure that we know what's really happening with these digital platforms and how this affects workers. It was funny to see someone on a bicycle with a backpack as an employer. But this, of course, happens. The world is changing. But we need to have social dialogue to protect everyone. So inflation, the cost of inflation, needs to be shared out amongst all of us. Those who benefit from this, sharing out this burden between the employers and employees, because this is not just about selling jobs. If we cannot revitalize and emphasize the value of labor, of jobs, consequences will be very negative. The value of jobs and of employment will decrease to almost zero. So this is the working together is a way to protect the economy and bolstering ourselves against inflation. Thanks very much, Fernando. I'm told that we have to stop in about 4 minutes. I think we have time for a quick overall reflection. I'd say looking towards the future, are you optimistic as regards the role of social dialogue? By definition, Fernando said that technological changes and new forms of work, and Rosa mentioned inflation and the cost of inflation. This divides a lot more the working world and the representatives of it, even more than the pandemic. So are you optimistic at all to be able to reach a salaries pact, wages agreement? Well, I'm an optimist by nature, definitely. This is not a question of weighing up whether we have to be optimistic or not. I think social dialogue is essential to respond to the major challenges we have. The main one is to protect salaries and wages. It's vital that social dialogue on a tripartite basis continues its activity, and that the social partners respond to the problem of inflation, and this has to come through imaginative solutions. We have to really be clear about the problems created by inflation. So at this moment, salaries are victims of inflation, not the cause. So also we are really enveloped in a process of looking at minimum salaries and how workers with the lowest wages can protect themselves against inflation. But social dialogue must really answer this challenge. So I think we are all involved in this global deal, emphasizing the need to govern transitions effectively. Green transition, digital transition must be worked through social dialogue at a multi-level approach. This is vital. But the European Union needs to go back to on the track of social dialogue with European directives based on agreements between the all the parties concerned. And we need new models to face the new style of work. And in ILO, we see that tripartite agreements or negotiations must not be a handicap to these agreements. So we need to work at multi-level to be able to resolve the urgent problem of inflation and also govern the transitions with using new content, because neither digital nor the green conversion process can work without bearing in mind the greatest interests of workers. So in Spain, we encourage our social partners, together with the INC, that we need a green INC. So bearing in mind the need for saving and the need of better use of our energy resources. So 1 minute for each. Just 1 minute, please. Well, we are also optimistic as regards social dialogue, because we think that results are good and they're tangible. But I think from the government, social government needs to be extrapolated further than the Ministry of Labour, because there are many other ministries that have major commitments and are not always, very often through social dialogue, we don't see their involvement. So thinking of social security, we haven't talked about this. There's a major agreement there, and we're going through the bargaining process. But other ministries have to come on board much more actively in the bipartite environment. We have to look for this major agreement. We realize that there's a margin to be able to increase salaries, and within this ANC, we see major aspects that we have to deal with. So we have a European digitization agreement extending to our environment, but we've also got climate change that we have to consider within the context of the ANC. So we have to reach an agreement. Okay, do you share that view, Rosa? Yes, I think going back to Joaquin and Marie Cruz, I absolutely share their optimism. I think for the first time in the history of humanity, the world has really worked out a common roadmap through sustainable development. Part of this affects labour relations and working conditions and the transformation of society. So this pushes forward social dialogue as a key tool there. So also, I think the ILO is a world benchmark for social dialogue, and we are all very accustomed to watching what they do. And I think the European Union is vital in their commitment for their next agenda, their coming agenda, to encourage social dialogue at state level and at EU level through their recommendations to the states, to member states. So also a commitment to encouraging more social dialogue concerned with teleworking also, because I think that we have a good example of how clear conviction that social dialogue is fundamental as a tool of governance. I think that has to be clear for all of us. So in this country, I'd like to make a bit of a more daring reflection. Up to now, social dialogue in this country, in this context of difficulty we've been talking about, has been tripartite and very much affected by the government agenda and also the recovery and resilience plan. And let's see if, I think now, because of the electoral debate, probably, I would like that this difference be made clear in our tripartite social dialogue. The push forward towards social dialogue is very important. from the government, but also respect for all members in this tripartite group. I think it's vital that, as Marie Cruz said, that this agreement for collective bargaining, which has had its difficult moments because of volatility and economic forecast. We hope that it will come to a happy ending, and the agreement on collective bargaining, although it's just a recommendation, it has a lot of strength in creating social peace and confidence, trust, and apart from salaries, it covers a lot of wide-ranging subjects for the development of the labour market. So I would just finish by saying that when social dialogue distances itself as a key element, this is not a la carte sort of menu. I think, in the business organizations and employers organizations, all the reforms that have taken place over these years through social dialogue, which should have their continuity, maintaining the debate through the panels on social dialogue, bringing in everyone affected. So there are many, there is a transposition of directives and the plan for recovery and resilience that can affect labour reform. And I think that it's vital that I say this publicly to Joaquin, who is the most convinced of social dialogue. We have to maintain a stable approach and with a continuous focus, as it were, as a key element of governance in this question. I'm optimistic, and I just want to draw your attention to the importance of preserving that space for social dialogue at a tripartite level and bipartite. So excess regulation sometimes, or intervention by the governments, to continue with this football simile, can invade to the other team's terrain, as it were. So we have to move forward with the processes. Yes, very briefly, I'm also optimistic, but I do defend the state and all European authorities also facilitate and bolster social dialogue through a legislative approach, and do not leave this to the market exclusively. Do not leave the labour conditions to the market, because this is when they get worse. When the market is in charge, creating more precarious conditions. So this is not profitable. So with regard to how we have to continue our social dialogue, well, once we see this, I think we need to negotiate in conditions of fairness and equality, with also defense of salaries and wages. Currently in the European Union, a directive has just been published to protect minimum salaries, minimum wages. It's very important that wages be a result of social dialogue, but also thanks to the state legislation, that they should cover aspects of sufficiency and dignity, because social dialogue must be governed by moderation and responsibility, but also dignity and sufficiency and guarantees. And this is where we will meet each other on an equal basis. Thank you, Fernando. Well, no time for a debate here, but I'd like to just say a few words. Let's see what the product of social dialogue is. I think you've talked about balance and sufficiency, very important. And I think there's a twofold meaning there. There's sufficiency in measures and sufficiency of it. I think you haven't developed perhaps the question of experts in this field, but I think these major ideas have to be materialized into specific measures. Otherwise, they're not sustainable. So efficiency and sustainability over time, the fruit of social dialogue usually lasts longer if it's not imposed from above. So this is very important. Another important benefit is that it has been mentioned is that social dialogue transcends political cycles or legislatures. This is very important. The creation of the ILO was meant to be a parliament for fairness, for social dialogue that goes beyond cycles, mandates of specific parties in government. So this has to be, it's very important to consult before decision making, and this is the principle of the ILO. So another result of social dialogue is that it should adapt effectively to the transformations in digitization, green transition, etc. This is vital because virtually all transformations occur in the labour market. This is fundamental to be conscious of. So so I'm very grateful to you all for your interventions and the contributions of Oscar Molina. And as the Deputy Secretary of State said, these are vital questions that we must all tackle. Thank you.